Everyone talks about Bruce Lee's fists of fury, but almost no one talks about the one thing that made him unstoppable, his humility. Let's uncover the truth behind his greatest strength, one that never threw a punch. When you hear the name Bruce Lee, your mind probably flashes to high-speed kicks, lightning-fast punches, or maybe that piercing battle cry that echoed through a generation. He's more than just a man. Bruce Lee is a legend. A symbol. A cultural icon whose influence spans continents and generations. But what if I told you that the greatest thing about Bruce Lee wasn't his physical strength, or even his fighting skill, but something far more invisible? Something almost no one talks about? Before we get there, let's rewind. Let's start at the beginning, not with the myth, but with the man. Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco in 1940, but raised in Hong Kong. His early life was a mixture of street fights, film sets, and philosophy books. He wasn't just born into martial arts, he was born into performance. His father was an opera singer and actor, and Bruce appeared in more than a dozen films as a child. But it wasn't all glamour. He got into trouble. He fought. He rebelled. And at just 18 years old, his parents sent him back to the US to straighten out his life. That straightening out turned into something extraordinary. Landing in Seattle, Bruce worked in restaurants and studied philosophy at the University of Washington. That's where he started formally teaching martial arts. Not traditional martial arts, though, not the slow, stiff movements locked in ancient rituals. Bruce was different. He believed martial arts should be fluid, adaptable, and real. That belief would one day shake the world. In the early 1960s, martial arts in America were still foreign, even exotic. Karate had barely made a dent in mainstream culture. Kung Fu? Most Americans hadn't even heard of it. Bruce changed all that, almost single-handedly. His early students weren't just everyday people. They included future stars like Steve McQueen, James Coburn, and even basketball legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Bruce didn't just teach them to punch and kick. He taught them philosophy, strategy, movement. His martial arts weren't about domination. They were about expression. By the time the 1970s rolled around, Bruce had become a sensation. But it wasn't easy. Hollywood didn't want a Chinese lead. Bruce pitched shows, wrote scripts, shot demos. Most studios shrugged. Some didn't even hide their racism. They loved his ideas, but wanted a white actor to play the lead. Imagine that. The man who would become the face of martial arts cinema almost wasn't allowed to show his face. But Bruce didn't stop. He went back to Hong Kong and signed a deal to make his own films. What followed was an explosion. The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon. These weren't just action movies. They were statements. Bruce didn't play sidekicks anymore. He was the hero, the leader, the champion. And audiences, especially in the US, couldn't get enough. His style was electric. Not just fast, poetic. Not just powerful, precise. It was like watching ballet with fists. And through it all, there was something more, a kind of raw honesty. Bruce didn't perform for the camera. He became the camera. Every move was a story. Every scene was a lesson. And then came Enter the Dragon, the film that would make him a global superstar. The first big-budget Hollywood martial arts film with an Asian lead. Bruce was finally where he belonged, on the world stage. But just 6 days before its release, he was gone. At just 32 years old, Bruce Lee died unexpectedly. The cause remains debated, but the impact is undeniable. Overnight, he became immortal. Not just in martial arts. Not just in film. But in the very identity of strength, discipline, and rebellion. Think about this. In the 1970s, America was going through massive change. Civil rights. Counterculture. Protests. People were tired of tradition, hungry for something real. Bruce Lee gave them that. He was Asian, but he spoke the language of struggle and power in a way that felt universal. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a symbol of self-mastery. Of breaking rules. Of redefining what strength looked like. He challenged stereotypes. In a time when Asian characters were often portrayed as weak, submissive, or comic relief, Bruce Lee showed up on screen as confident, brilliant, and dangerous, not in a villainous way, but as a hero. as someone to admire, not mock. He showed American audiences something they hadn't seen before, an Asian man who didn't bow down, who didn't get the short end of the script, who didn't need saving, because he was doing the saving. His influence in the US is still visible today. Mixed martial arts? Wouldn't exist in its current form without him. The rise of Asian leads in Hollywood? He cracked that door open. The obsession with self-help, discipline, and mind-body connection? Bruce was way ahead of that curve. In a world obsessed with the loud, the flashy, the obvious, Bruce was something different. He could be loud when he needed to, flashy when it mattered. But underneath the surface was a thinker, a philosopher, a student, always learning, always adapting. That adaptability is what birthed Jeet Kune Do, his personal martial arts philosophy. It wasn't about forms or rituals. It was about honesty, using what works, discarding what doesn't, flowing like water, as he famously said. Be like water. It's one of his most quoted lines. But how many people really understand what it means? Water doesn't resist. It doesn't have a shape, but it takes any shape. It can crash or it can flow. That wasn't just about fighting. That was Bruce's life philosophy. Be adaptable. Be humble. Don't cling to form. Cling to truth. And truth, for Bruce, was simple. You are your biggest opponent. Not the guy in front of you. Not society. Not tradition. You. Now think about that. A man at the height of fame, with cameras in his face, fans screaming his name, studios begging for his image, and yet his biggest message was, humble yourself. Strip away ego. Find the real you. In American culture, that message was, and still is, radical. We love winners. We love confidence. We love bravado. But Bruce wasn't about bravado. He was about mastery, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to shout. And yet, ironically, his silence spoke louder than most people's screams. The legacy he left behind isn't just in fight scenes or movie posters. It's in people's lives. In how they train. How they think. How they move through the world. From small dojos in Texas to film schools in New York, Bruce Lee is everywhere. Even in business circles, Bruce's quotes are used to talk about leadership, innovation, growth. Adapt what is useful, reject what is useless. That's startup culture in a nutshell. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. That's personal branding. Bruce's words have become mantras, and not just for fighters. So it's no surprise that over 50 years after his death, Bruce Lee is still a household name in the US. Kids still wear his shirts. Fighters still study his form. Actors still mimic his moves. And fans, millions of them, still treat him like a living legend. But here's where it gets interesting. With all the attention on his strength, speed, and success, there's one side of Bruce Lee that's been quietly overlooked. The side that may have mattered most. His humility. Because for all the noise, for all the myths and merchandise, Bruce never saw himself as a god. He never bought into his own hype. He remained a student, always searching, always learning. Even at his peak. And that's what part 2 is about, the superhuman myth. The way Bruce Lee became something bigger than life. The stories that made him seem untouchable. And how, in the middle of all that myth-making, he somehow stayed grounded. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon a man can have, is the ability to stay small in a world that wants to make him large. Bruce Lee wasn't just a man. Somewhere along the way, he became a myth. Ask anyone who's even slightly familiar with martial arts, and they'll tell you about his speed, his strength, the way he moved like lightning. They'll talk about the one-inch punch, the flying kicks, the way he could explode across the room in a blink. It's like talking about a superhero. Only difference? Bruce Lee was real. But what's fascinating, and a little dangerous, is how easily reality gets swallowed up by legend. Bruce was undoubtedly exceptional. But over time, the stories about him have started to feel like they belong in comic books. There are tales of him punching bags so hard they flew across the room, kicking people and sending them flying through doors, outpacing world-class fighters with barely a warm-up, even stopping a fight before it started, with just one look. Some of these stories are true. Some are exaggerated. And some? Well, no one really knows anymore. And that's the power of perception. Bruce didn't ask to be treated like a god. But he became one anyway, especially in the West. After Enter the Dragon, he was no longer just an actor or a martial artist. He was the martial artist. The gold standard. The symbol of human potential. His muscles were shredded but functional, not for show, but for purpose. His movements had no waste, no drag, just pure explosive energy. And that made people wonder, is this guy even human? One of the most famous legends is the one-inch punch. A demonstration where Bruce Lee places his fist just an inch away from someone's chest, then hits with such force that the person flies backward. That's not special effects. That's biomechanics, leverage, timing, and a ridiculous amount of practice. People have tried to replicate that punch for decades. Some get close. Most don't. Because it's not just about strength. It's about control. That's what Bruce had, more than any fighter before or after him. He once sparred with a karate champion, a real heavyweight. During the exchange, Bruce moved so fast that the footage had to be slowed down just to catch his strikes. Cameras couldn't keep up with him. Editors had to manually slow scenes in the Green Hornet because viewers couldn't see what was happening. That's not myth. That's documented. But it wasn't just his speed. It was his understanding of the space between movements. Bruce knew when to go full force, when to pull back, when to pause, and in that pause, he controlled the entire rhythm of a fight. He trained like a machine, often clocking in 6 or 7 hours of physical training daily, not just drills, but flexibility, strength, endurance, speed. He shadowboxed with weights, ran several miles a day, bounced between isometrics, calisthenics, and pure muscle-burning repetition. He wasn't building a body for the beach. He was building a weapon. And that weapon wasn't for destroying others. It was for mastering himself. In the US, this level of discipline caught fire. Bruce came at a time when American audiences were shifting from the Western cowboy ideal to something more global, more refined. He offered something new, a warrior who didn't fight for dominance, but for self-control. A fighter who quoted Lao Tzu and Nietzsche before he threw a punch. He was part monk, part gladiator. And in that contrast, that delicate balance, people saw something divine. He was also charming. Off-screen, Bruce had this magnetic confidence that made everyone around him feel energized. He cracked jokes, pulled pranks, made people laugh. He wasn't some cold, stoic master. He was alive, animated, always present. And that made the myth even more powerful. How could someone be so good, so intense, and yet so grounded? It's no wonder people started to elevate him into the realm of the superhuman. Even decades later, Bruce remains a benchmark. Fighters today, MMA legends, boxers, even Olympic athletes, still name him as an inspiration. Not because he won titles or trophies, but because of what he represented, the possibility of total mastery. In 2004, UFC President Dana White famously said, "Bruce Lee is the father of mixed martial arts." Think about that. The guy who died decades before the UFC was even born is now considered the philosophical godfather of the sport. And it makes sense. Bruce was one of the first to say, "Take what works. Leave the rest." He didn't care about tradition for tradition's sake. He wasn't loyal to a single style or system. He created Jeet Kune Do, not as a style, but as an anti-style. A way of fighting without the limitations of labels. He believed in being formless, the idea that no one technique, no one approach, could handle every situation. That kind of thinking blew up the martial arts world. And in America, where reinvention is king, Bruce's message felt like gospel. He fought racism with excellence. Instead of complaining about discrimination, he outperformed. He knew the system was rigged, but rather than play their game, he built his own arena. And in that arena, he was king. Still, with every king comes a kingdom, and his was built on myths. The problem with being seen as superhuman is that people forget you're human. Bruce had injuries, setbacks, doubts. He tore his back in training and spent months bedridden. Doctors told him he might never kick again. He didn't accept that. He studied physiology, redesigned his training, and came back stronger. But those moments often get left out of the legend. They don't fit the image of the untouchable warrior. That's the downside of myth-making. It erases the struggle. And Bruce did struggle. He was frustrated by Hollywood. He felt boxed in by stereotypes. He knew he had more to offer than just kicks and punches. He wanted to act, direct, write, to be seen as a full artist, not just a martial arts guy. He had to fight for every inch of recognition. His charisma helped. His skills helped more. But even then, the system kept trying to minimize him, to shrink him into something marketable, digestible. Bruce wouldn't have it. That resistance is part of why he became so legendary. He didn't just fight on screen. He fought off screen. For roles. For respect. For space. And when he finally got it, when Enter the Dragon hit theaters, it felt like vindication. The American public saw what Bruce's students already knew. This wasn't just a martial artist. This was a force of nature. But here's the twist. As much as America loved the idea of Bruce Lee, the warrior, the dragon, the myth, many people never truly understood him. They worshipped the surface, the abs, the screams, the power. But they often missed the foundation underneath. Because Bruce wasn't chasing invincibility. He wasn't trying to become a god. He was trying to become himself. All those countless hours of training, all those deep dives into philosophy, all those experiments with movement and mindset, they weren't about ego. They were about truth. And that's what made him so dangerous. Not his fists. Not his kicks. But his clarity. In a world filled with noise, Bruce moved with purpose. In a culture obsessed with image, Bruce focused on essence. In an industry built on hype, Bruce lived for truth. And yet, he got turned into a brand. A legend. A myth. So now, decades later, we're left with two Bruce Lees, the one people talk about, and the one who actually lived. One is invincible. The other is human. One never loses. The other doubts, struggles, breaks, rebuilds. One is worshipped. The other, often forgotten. But here's the beautiful part. The real Bruce Lee, the human Bruce, is actually more inspiring than the myth. Because the myth says, you can never be like him. But the man says, you can, if you're willing to do the work. And that brings us to the core of this story. Not the kicks. Not the fights. Not the films. But the mindset. Bruce Lee didn't become great because he was stronger than everyone. He became great because he was more humble than everyone. Even at the top, he remained a student. Even as the world praised him, he kept learning. Kept adapting. Kept searching. That's the secret no one talks about. We celebrate his strength, but forget his softness. We quote his power, but overlook his patience. We admire his courage, but miss his humility. That humility wasn't a weakness. It was his edge. His secret weapon. The thing that allowed him to keep growing, even when others would have plateaued. And that's what we're going to explore next. Because if you really want to understand Bruce Lee, if you really want to see what made him unstoppable, you have to look past the muscles and the movies. You have to look at the one thing he carried with him everywhere, into every fight, every room, every role. His humility. If strength was Bruce Lee's sword, then humility was the hand that wielded it. It's funny. When people think of Bruce Lee, they see the fighter. The intensity. The rippling muscles, the screams, the speed that could blur reality. But ask the people who actually knew him, his students, his friends, his family, and they'll tell you something surprising. Bruce wasn't all ego and fire. He wasn't walking around trying to prove he was better than everyone. He was curious. Always learning. Always listening. He'd beat you in sparring, and then ask what you thought he could do better. He'd throw a perfect punch, and then say, let's work on your form. That's not arrogance. That's humility. And for Bruce, it wasn't just a personality trait, it was a strategy. See, humility isn't about lowering yourself. It's about staying open. And Bruce was always open. To new ideas. To feedback. To evolution. That's rare, especially when you're already on top. Most people, once they get good at something, they stop growing. They defend their position. They hold on tight. But Bruce? He tore down the pedestal before anyone could put him on it. Even as people around him started to treat him like a god, he kept reminding himself, I'm not here to impress. I'm here to express. That difference, between impressing and expressing, shaped everything he did. Impressing is about ego. It's about showing off, proving your worth, demanding respect. But expressing? That's about truth. Honesty. Connection. Bruce wasn't performing. He was revealing. He wasn't saying, look how powerful I am. He was saying, this is who I am. This is what I've learned. Take it, adapt it, grow with it. And that takes humility. One of Bruce's most famous quotes goes like this. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. That's not just a fighting philosophy. That's a life philosophy. And it requires a mindset most people don't develop until much later, if ever. To absorb what is useful, you have to be willing to learn from anyone. Doesn't matter if they are younger, less experienced, or from a different tradition. Bruce trained with boxers, wrestlers, judo practitioners, street fighters, anyone who could challenge him. He didn't care where a technique came from, only if it worked. To discard what is not, you have to admit that not everything you learned is sacred. You have to be willing to let go of your ego, your attachments, your comfort zones. Bruce broke with martial arts tradition. He questioned rigid systems. He dropped what didn't serve him, even if it was something he had practiced for years. And to add what is uniquely your own? That takes courage. Because it means you're not hiding behind a style or a label. You're stepping forward and saying, this is me. And that kind of authenticity is only possible when you're not trying to be someone else, not trying to prove anything. Just trying to live your truth. All of that requires humility. Quiet, consistent, powerful humility. But Bruce didn't grow up humble. He became humble. As a teenager in Hong Kong, he was brash, cocky, always getting into fights. He had talent, no doubt, but also attitude. He thought he knew everything. Until he met teachers who humbled him. Masters who showed him how little he really knew. That's where the seed was planted. Then he moved to America, and suddenly, he was the outsider. The underdog. A Chinese immigrant teaching martial arts to white and black students during a time of heavy racism. He had to prove himself all over again. But instead of getting bitter, he got better. That's the thing about humility. It grows in struggle. In discomfort. In failure. Bruce faced rejection after rejection in Hollywood. Producers told him his accent was too strong. That Americans wouldn't accept an Asian lead. That he was too authentic. Can you imagine that? Too authentic. He could have let it eat him up. Could have conformed. Could have quit. Instead, he kept training. Kept creating. Kept dreaming. And through it all, he remained grounded. He stayed humble. Because he knew, success is temporary. Fame is a wave. But your character, that's the ocean. When people finally started to recognize his genius, when Enter the Dragon made him a global icon, he didn't start acting like a god. He stayed Bruce. A man who loved philosophy, who practiced calligraphy, who played with his kids, who kept training like he was still the underdog. Even when the world was bowing to him, Bruce was still bowing back. In interviews, he rarely bragged. He talked about the process. The discipline. The failures. He shared his doubts. His fears. His journey. He was open about how hard it was to balance fame with purpose. How easy it would be to get lost in the spotlight. But he didn't let it consume him. Because he had something stronger than ambition, self-awareness. That's what humility really is. Not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Shifting your focus from how you look to what you're learning. Bruce wrote in his personal notes, to know oneself is to study oneself in action with another person. That's not just martial arts. That's life. And he lived that truth, on the mat, in his relationships, in his creative work. Here's another example, Bruce taught celebrities. Big names. Steve McQueen. James Coburn. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He trained them, guided them, and yet never acted like he was above them. He didn't use their fame to boost his own. He didn't name drop or brag. In fact, most of those relationships remained deeply personal. Because for Bruce, teaching wasn't a status move. It was a service. And service requires humility. He once said, "The key to immortality is first living a life worth remembering." That's what he aimed for. Not power. Not prestige. But impact. And look around. He succeeded. Today, people wear his face on t-shirts. Quote his words on posters. Study his films. Read his writings. They try to move like him, think like him, be like him. But the real lesson Bruce left behind isn't in his moves. It's in his mindset. That mindset says, stay hungry. Stay open. Stay humble. Never stop learning. Never stop questioning. Never stop evolving. Don't let praise inflate you. Don't let failure destroy you. Just keep showing up. Keep working. Keep expressing what's real. That's Bruce Lee's real legacy. It's not about throwing the fastest punch, or kicking the highest, or winning the most fights. It's about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to prove anything, because you're already at peace with who you are. Humility made Bruce Lee unstoppable. Because while others were defending their past, he was creating his future. While others were protecting their pride, he was sharpening his craft. While others were chasing applause, he was chasing truth. And that truth is simple: the most powerful people in the world don't need to be loud. They don't need to be flashy. They don't even need to be seen. They just need to be. That's the essence of Bruce Lee. A man who could destroy you with a strike, but chose instead to teach you something deeper.